Sometimes the most powerful moments in life happen in silence, between a father's quiet sacrifice and a daughter's unwavering faith. In a small town where whispers travel faster than truth, one man weighed down by the past will find himself standing at the edge of something unexpected. Not through glory, not through applause, but through one act that would change everything, not just for him, but for the people who had stopped believing that second chances still existed. If you enjoy heartfelt healing stories about resilience, quiet courage, and the unexpected beauty of human connection, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories like this one to life. Now let's begin. A poor single dad was mocked at the shooting range until his shot shattered a long-held record. The sun had barely risen above the line of cottonwoods when Eli Morgan tightened the worn laces of his work boots and stepped outside. His modest rental house, paint peeling, porch sagging, sat quietly on the edge of Willow Creek, a town where everybody knew your name, and most thought they knew your story too. Eli didn't mind the whispers anymore. They were just background noise against the only voice that mattered, the sweet, drowsy murmur of his 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, still tangled in her covers, her small chest rising and falling in sleep. He closed the door softly behind him, shoving his hands deep into the pockets of his frayed jacket as he made his way to the battered Ford truck parked out front. It coughed and sputtered in protest, but, like Eli, it refused to quit. Today's job was a leaky roof 2 towns over. Nothing glamorous, but it meant groceries for the week. Before pulling out of the driveway, he glanced at the rearview mirror. The faded photo tucked into the corner stared back at him. Emma, his late wife, holding newborn Sophie, both beaming as if the world were nothing but endless summer days. Eli's jaw tightened. It had been 4 years, but some wounds didn't scab over. Some stayed raw, hidden beneath layers of duty and dust. He forced himself to focus, one step at a time. That was the only way he knew to survive. Evenings were Eli's favorite part of the day. After Sophie finished her homework, always perched on the kitchen counter because the rickety table wobbled too much, they would sit together on the porch swing. Sophie would chatter about school, her voice bright and animated, while Eli mended old jackets or tinkered with broken tools. The swing creaked in rhythm, the crickets provided the music, and for a little while, the world felt less heavy. That night, Sophie waved a crumpled flyer in front of him. "Daddy, look, they're having a festival, with games and rides and a shooting competition. Can we go, please?" Eli smiled at her enthusiasm, feeling a pang deep inside. Money was tight, tighter than he let her see, but maybe a few dollars for cotton candy and a ride or two could be spared. Besides, Sophie deserved a memory that didn't involve secondhand clothes or dollar store toys. "We'll go, Bug," he promised, ruffling her honey-colored hair. She squealed in delight, flinging her arms around his neck. "You're the best daddy ever." Eli held her close, inhaling the scent of soap and sunshine still clinging to her. If being a hero in her eyes cost him a few extra hours of overtime, it was a price he would pay gladly. The night before the festival, Eli sat alone at the kitchen table, an old leather wallet open in front of him. He counted the bills. Small, worn, too few. Rent was due next week. The truck needed new tires. Sophie's sneakers had holes he couldn't ignore much longer. He rubbed his hands over his face, feeling the weight of decisions that always seemed stacked against him. But when he looked toward the narrow hallway, saw the faint glow of Sophie's nightlight and the way she clutched her threadbare stuffed rabbit even in sleep, he knew there was no choice to make. Somehow he would make it work. Hope, after all, was stitched into the very fabric of fatherhood. Saturday dawned bright and blue, a perfect day for a small-town celebration. Sophie wore her favorite denim jacket, patched at the elbows, and a pair of sneakers Eli had painstakingly glued back together late one night. The town square bustled with laughter, music, and the sugary scent of funnel cakes. Eli kept a firm grip on Sophie's hand, letting her tug him from booth to booth, her excitement contagious. They wandered past the shooting range, where a crowd had gathered. A large banner overhead proclaimed, "Annual Willow Creek Marksman Challenge, $500 prize." Sophie's eyes widened. "Daddy, you should try. You were a soldier, right? I bet you're really good." Eli chuckled softly. "That was a long time ago, Bug." "But you're still amazing," she said with absolute conviction. He squeezed her hand gently. Maybe just watch this year, huh? She pouted but nodded, settling against him as they watched burly men in flannel shirts boast and laugh, each taking their turn at the targets lined up 50 yards away. Near the center of the group stood Wade Carlson, a local mechanic with an overinflated ego and a talent for making himself the center of attention. Wade's booming laugh carried across the field as he slapped backs and winked at the teenage girls fluttering nearby. When he caught sight of Eli standing at the sidelines, dusty boots and patched jeans marking him instantly as an outsider to the day's festivities, Wade's smile turned mean. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Wade crowed. "Here to teach us how to shoot, Mr. War Hero? Or just looking for a handout?" A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Sophie stiffened beside him, her small fingers curling into the fabric of his jacket. Eli felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up his neck, but he refused to let it show. He tucked Sophie closer under his arm and gave Wade a bland, nonchalant nod, as if the words hadn't even landed. Because they hadn't, not where it counted. Let them laugh. Let them whisper. Eli had nothing to prove, to them or to anyone else. The only target that mattered was the one he faced every morning in the mirror. The promise to be the kind of man his daughter could look up to. And on that front, he never missed. The festival stretched across Main Street like a living, breathing organism. Vendors shouted over the hum of the crowd, children darted between booths clutching balloons, and the scent of popcorn, grilled corn, and kettle corn drifted heavy in the warm afternoon air. Eli Morgan tightened his grip on Sophie's hand as she bounced excitedly beside him, her pigtails swinging in time with her steps. Her face was aglow with the kind of happiness he wished he could bottle and save for the tougher days that inevitably came. For once, Eli allowed himself to breathe a little easier. It didn't take much for Sophie to find magic in the ordinary. A paper crown from the prize booth, a candy apple bigger than her head, a clumsy face painting of a butterfly on her cheek. Eli paid the few dollars for each with quiet gratitude, calculating every cent in the back of his mind, but never letting the concern reach his daughter's bright eyes. Music from a live bluegrass band spilled from the makeshift stage at the far end of the street. Sophie tugged him toward the sound, laughing when Eli awkwardly shuffled his feet in an imitation of the dancers whirling in the open square. "You're terrible, Daddy," she giggled, clapping her hands. "I know," Eli said, grinning despite himself. "That's why your mama never let me near a dance floor." It wasn't a memory that hurt. It was one that warmed, a sliver of light from a time before grief had crept into the corners of his life. They wandered through the fair, Sophie marveling at every booth. She pulled him toward a table where an older woman sold homemade quilts stitched with tiny, perfect patterns. Eli admired the craftsmanship, tracing the delicate seams with rough fingertips. "These are beautiful," he said to the woman behind the booth. She beamed, lines of kindness etched into her weathered face. "Hand-stitched with love. Every stitch tells a story." Eli nodded, understanding more than she knew. Sometimes the stories weren't perfect, but they were still worth telling. The shooting competition was the heart of the festival, and its stage was impossible to miss. A large wooden arch draped in patriotic bunting framed the entrance to the range, where rows of targets stood like silent sentinels. Sophie's excitement peaked as they approached. She dragged him forward, barely able to contain herself. "Come on, Daddy, let's go watch." The competitors were already gathering. Eli recognized a few faces: farmers, mechanics, retired veterans. Good men, most of them, hardworking, proud. Then there was Wade Carlson, holding court near the firing line like he owned the place. Wade's thick arms were crossed over his chest, a smirk plastered across his broad face as he basked in the attention of a small crowd. Eli hung back, instinctively steering Sophie toward the edge of the gathering. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here for cotton candy and laughter and memories, not pride or confrontation. A voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "Step right up, folks. Open class begins in 15 minutes. Entries free this year, thanks to our generous sponsors. Bragging rights and a $500 prize up for grabs." At the announcement, Wade whooped loudly, making a show of polishing an imaginary trophy in his hands. A ripple of laughter followed. Sophie looked up at Eli with shining eyes. "You should do it, Daddy. I know you can win." Eli chuckled, shaking his head. I'm a little out of practice, Bug. But you used to be the best, she insisted, bouncing on the balls of her feet. You told me stories. Eli crouched down so they were eye level. That was a long time ago. Besides, this isn't about being the best. We're here to have fun, remember? She deflated slightly, the corners of her mouth drooping. I just wish everyone could see how amazing you are. The simplicity and sincerity of her words struck him harder than any insult Wade Carlson could throw. Before Eli could respond, a friendly voice interrupted. Hey there. A woman stood nearby, clipboard in hand. She wore a staff badge around her neck, her brown hair pulled into a loose braid, a warm smile lighting up her face. It was Annie Brooks, the town's newest shooting range manager, and, rumor had it, a woman with a heart almost too big for her own good. You two thinking about signing up? She asked, her gaze kind and inviting. Eli opened his mouth to decline politely, but Sophie beat him to it. Yes, my daddy's a soldier. He's really good. Annie laughed softly. Well, that sounds like a ringing endorsement, if I ever heard one. She glanced at Eli. No pressure, she said, lowering her voice so only he could hear. But it would mean a lot to some folks to see a good man step up. And sometimes these things are about more than hitting a bullseye. Eli studied her for a moment. She wasn't pushing. She wasn't mocking. Just offering a bridge he could choose to cross. Or not. He looked at Sophie, her face a mixture of hope and adoration, and realized something deep and quiet inside himself. Maybe it was time to stop hiding behind the weight of the past. Maybe it was time to show his daughter that courage wasn't about fighting wars overseas. It was about standing tall, even when the world expected you to shrink. He straightened slowly, feeling a surprising lightness in his chest. All right, he said, ruffling Sophie's hair. Let's give it a shot. The grin that spread across her face was worth every ounce of hesitation. Annie handed him the registration form with a wink. Good luck, Mr. Morgan. Something tells me you're going to surprise a few people today. As Eli scrawled his name onto the paper, he wasn't thinking about the prize money or the smirks he might face. He was thinking about the little girl who believed, with every beat of her heart, that her father could still be a hero. And maybe, just maybe, she was right. The midday sun hung heavy overhead, bleaching the sky to a washed-out blue as the shooting range buzzed with anticipation. Townsfolk crowded around the perimeter, some standing on tiptoes to get a better view, others shading their eyes with calloused hands. The scent of gunpowder mixed with popcorn and fresh-cut grass, a strangely fitting cocktail for Willow Creek's most anticipated competition of the year. Eli adjusted the borrowed rifle in his hands, feeling its weight, the balance familiar but distant, like a song he hadn't sung in years. He checked the sights out of habit, ignoring the burn of stairs prickling the back of his neck. Sophie stood by the side railing, bouncing on her toes, waving every time he glanced her way. Her optimism wrapped around him like armor against the skeptical, amused looks from the crowd. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here because a little girl with a butterfly painted on her cheek believed in him. That would have to be enough. Look at that, Wade Carlson's voice sliced through the murmur of the crowd. Didn't know we were letting the charity cases compete this year. Laughter rippled through the gathered onlookers, low and mean. Eli felt the blood surge to his ears, but kept his face impassive. He wasn't about to bite at the bait. He knew men like Wade, loud, insecure, desperate for attention. Maybe he thinks there's a prize for pity, someone else chimed in. Louder now, emboldened by the safety of numbers, Eli shifted his grip on the rifle, his fingers steady, his heart remarkably calm. He had faced worse than mockery, far worse. Annie Brooks, standing by the registration table, caught his eye and offered a small, encouraging nod. Her expression wasn't pitying. It was full of quiet respect. That mattered more than all the jeers in the world. Still, the laughter gnawed at the edges of the moment, threatening to dim the small flame of confidence he'd painstakingly built. He glanced at Sophie. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't embarrassed. She stood tall, hands balled into determined little fists, her eyes locked on him with pure, unwavering pride. Eli exhaled slowly and turned his focus inward, drawing up old instincts buried under years of disuse. Breath control, sight picture, trigger squeeze. It all came back like muscle memory, like breathing. The announcer's voice blared from the loudspeakers, startling a few in the front row. Next up, Eli Morgan. First 3 shots at 50 yards, standing position. Let's give him a round of applause. The clapping was half-hearted, scattered. A few obligatory whistles and whoops sounded, more sarcasm than support. Eli stepped forward, planting his boots firmly on the marked line. The range stretched out before him, 3 metal targets painted white with bright red bullseyes. Simple, clean, unforgiving. He inhaled deeply, letting the chaos of the festival fall away. There was no crowd, no Wade. No doubt, just the target, just the shot. He lifted the rifle, pressing it snugly against his shoulder, took aim, and fired. The first shot rang out sharp and true, splitting the summer air. A distant metallic clink followed half a second later. The spotter raised his flag. Direct hit! Murmurs swept through the crowd. A few people clapped, genuinely this time. Eli didn't allow himself even a flicker of satisfaction. He chambered the second round. Breathe in, sight picture, squeeze. The rifle barked again. Another metallic clink. Another direct hit, the spotter called, louder this time, a note of excitement creeping into his voice. Now the crowd shifted, murmuring in earnest. A few spectators leaned forward, craning their necks for a better view. Even Wade's smug grin faltered slightly, his arms uncrossing from over his chest. Eli felt the shift, but he stayed locked in. Focus. Control. The third shot was the hardest, not because of the technical difficulty, but because of what it meant. This shot could tie the all-time record. This shot could silence the sneers and laughter. More importantly, this shot could show Sophie that her faith had been justified. He inhaled slowly, steadying the tremor of anticipation in his hands, sighted down the barrel, and squeezed. The final shot cracked through the range like a lightning strike. Silence swallowed the field. A long, suspended beat. Then the spotter yelled, his voice ringing out clear and disbelieving. Direct hit! Center bullseye! The crowd erupted. Cheers, whistles, scattered applause, growing louder by the second. Eli lowered the rifle slowly, blinking against the rush of sunlight and noise. Sophie screamed his name, hopping up and down in uncontainable excitement. He felt himself smiling, wide and genuine, for the first time in what felt like years. The announcer stumbled over the microphone, flustered. Ladies and gentlemen, that shot, well, folks, he just tied the Willow Creek record. Standing position, 3 perfect shots. Even Annie Brooks clapped, her smile proud and full of something else, something deeper. Wade Carlson's face darkened like a summer storm cloud. He muttered something Eli couldn't hear, then turned and shouldered his way through the crowd, disappearing into the parking lot. Eli didn't bother to watch him leave. He knelt down instead, just in time for Sophie to barrel into his arms, nearly knocking him over. You did it, Daddy, she shrieked. You're the best. I knew it. I always knew it. Eli hugged her tight, burying his face in her hair. Thank you, Bug, he whispered, voice thick. Not for the cheering, not for the redemption, but for believing in him when he struggled to believe in himself. As they left the shooting range hand in hand, Eli glanced back one last time. The targets gleamed in the sun, each one marked by a perfect shot. But it wasn't the bullseyes he'd remember. It was the feeling, pure and simple, that maybe, just maybe, he was still capable of something good, something lasting. Maybe today wasn't just about hitting a mark. Maybe it was about starting over. And this time, he wouldn't miss. The fair had begun to wind down. Streamers fluttered lazily in the breeze, and the booths that had pulsed with laughter and color only hours ago now stood half empty, vendors packing up beneath a sky-tinged orange and gold. But the shooting range was still buzzing. Eli sat on a bench just off to the side, Sophie tucked against him, her arms wrapped tightly around the silver trophy she insisted on holding. She had carried it all the way from the announcer's platform to the edge of the field like it was a royal crown. She hadn't stopped smiling since the final shot. Neither had Eli. Not really. His smile was softer, quieter, less triumphant, and more humbled. Across the way, Annie Brooks was dismantling the scoreboard, methodically removing the wooden slats that had displayed each competitor's score. Her sleeves were rolled up, a few strands of hair escaping her braid. She moved with the kind of ease that came from competence, not performance. When she noticed Eli watching, she gave a small wave. He hesitated only a second before nodding to Sophie. "Stay here a minute, Bug." Sophie looked up. "Where are you going?" "Just over there." He pointed toward Annie, then lowered his voice conspiratorially. "To say thank you to the nice lady who talked me into this." Sophie giggled and gave an exaggerated thumbs up. "Tell her I said she's awesome." Eli ruffled her hair and walked across the dirt path toward Annie. She turned as he approached, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Hey there, sharpshooter," she said, offering a smile. "You've got most of the town talking." Eli gave a modest shrug. "Guess I got lucky." "No," she replied, setting the score slats aside. "You didn't. That wasn't luck. That was someone with steady hands and a steady heart." Eli tilted his head, unsure how to respond to a compliment so simply and sincerely given. "I didn't do it for the prize," he finally said. "I know," she said. "I saw why you did it." She glanced past him, toward Sophie, still cradling the trophy like it was made of gold. "She believes in you," Annie continued. "You can see it in her eyes, the way she looks at you. It's like you hung the moon." Eli's throat tightened. "She's all I've got." "That's not nothing," Annie said gently. "It's everything." A brief silence settled between them, not awkward, but thoughtful. Then she added almost shyly, "I hope this doesn't sound too forward, but I'm glad you stepped up today. Kids need to see good men win sometimes, not just the loud ones." That tugged a quiet smile from Eli. "Well, I wasn't planning to do much more than buy her a cotton candy." "I think she got more than that," Annie said. He looked at her again, really looked. There was kindness in her eyes, not the soft, pitying kind people offered him when they heard widower or single dad. No, this was different. This was grounded in respect, recognition, maybe even something else. He wasn't ready to name it yet. "She's been through a lot," Eli said. "Losing her mom, it changed everything. For both of us." "I'm sorry," Annie said quietly. "She doesn't remember much of her," he added. "She was only 3. He paused. "I've tried so hard to give her a good life, to be enough. But some days I feel like I'm building a house with no walls." Annie nodded as if she understood. "You're still building, though. That counts." Eli studied her face. There was no judgment there, just warmth and understanding, the rare kind you didn't often find in strangers. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "thanks for not laughing me off the field. I knew you'd do fine. You didn't even know me." "No," she agreed, "but I saw the way you held her hand. That told me more than a resume ever could." Eli laughed softly, then looked down at his boots. "You know," she added with a playful tilt of her head, "we could use someone like you at the range. We have a beginner's class for teens and new shooters. Nothing fancy, but it's a good way to spend a Saturday or two." He looked up. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you an opportunity," she said gently. "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. I think you'd be good at it. And we'd pay you. Not much, but enough to matter." It was the way she said it. Not as charity, not as a handout, but as a genuine offer of respect that made Eli pause. He didn't answer right away. He just nodded once, slowly. "I'll think about it," Annie smiled. "That's all I ask." A breeze swept past them, stirring the scent of fresh hay and fading popcorn. The fair was nearly gone now, the final music echoing softly down the quieting street. Eli turned to leave but stopped, glancing over his shoulder. "Annie," he said. She looked up. "Thanks for seeing me today." She didn't answer right away, but her eyes softened. "You're welcome. And for the record, I think a lot of people saw you." He nodded and walked back toward his daughter, who jumped up as he approached. "Well," she asked, "did you tell her?" "Tell her what?" "That she's awesome," Eli chuckled. "I think she already knows." They walked home slowly, Sophie chattering about the fair, the trophy, the funnel cake, the fireworks she hoped to see next year. Eli mostly listened, grateful for the sound of her voice. But in the back of his mind, he heard Annie's words again. "We're still building. That counts." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it might just be true. The following Saturday came with a sky so clear it looked painted, a rare day where the wind carried the scent of earth and honeysuckle, and the town felt quieter than usual, like it was waiting for something. Eli stood at the edge of the range again, this time without a crowd, without jeers, and without the rush of competition. Just the hollow stillness of empty bleachers, a rack of rifles near the office, and the faint thump of targets swaying in the breeze. Annie had invited him back for a quiet practice session. She called it a way to test the new setup for next year's event. But Eli suspected it was more than that. It was an invitation to reclaim something he thought he'd lost. The truth was, he hadn't touched a weapon, not like this, since his last tour overseas. Not since Emma's funeral. In the years that followed, he'd learned to use his hands to mend broken things. Pipes, hinges, heating ducts, not to destroy. The precision, the calm, the control, it had once defined him. And then, after the war and the grief, it vanished. Until last week. Until 3 bullets, perfectly placed, reminded him of who he once was. Annie stood beside him now, clipboard in hand, relaxed in jeans and a faded t-shirt that read, "Support local heroes," a detail Eli noticed without meaning to. "You ready?" she asked. He nodded once. "Same distance," she added, gesturing to the 50-yard mark. "Same position. But I want you to try one thing different today." Eli glanced sideways. "What's that?" She smiled. "Don't aim to prove anything. Just shoot." The rifle was smoother than the one from the fair. Well-oiled, balanced, a custom grip. Annie had loaned it from the range's private stock. "Consider it a thank you for not letting Carlson win," she'd joked. Eli took his stance slowly, feet shoulder-width apart, spine aligned, every motion fluid and exact. The rifle felt like an extension of his arm now, the scope like a second eye. In this quiet, there were no distractions, no laughter, no pressure, no shame, just breath and focus, and something steady in his chest that hadn't been there in years. He inhaled, exhaled, squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the range, clean and precise. A half-second later, the distant metallic ping confirmed it. Dead center. Annie glanced up from her clipboard. "Nice." Eli didn't answer. He was already chambering the second round. Shot 2, slightly faster. A sharper recoil. Still perfect. Annie didn't say anything this time. Her eyes narrowed, curious. Eli paused with the third bullet in his hand, his fingers brushing the smooth metal. He looked downrange again, but this time, something shifted. This wasn't about shooting anymore. It wasn't about records or redemption or shutting someone like Wade Carlson up. This was about Sophie, about Emma, about a future he hadn't dared imagine. It was about showing himself, and maybe Annie, that what he carried inside wasn't just memory or damage. It was still purpose, still strength, still worth something. He took a slow breath, heart steady, then pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot echoed longer this time, the kind of echo that didn't stop in your ears. It hit somewhere deeper. There was a pause. Then, clink. Annie stepped forward with a slight frown, her eyes squinting toward the target. She raised a hand to block the glare. "Did you see that?" Eli lowered the rifle and followed her gaze. The third target had been torn, neatly, impossibly, dead through the center. Not just a bullseye, a shot within a shot. The kind of impact that split a hole already made. Annie walked forward, motioning Eli to follow. They reached the line together. She examined the 3 targets, running her fingers along the punctures. These aren't just clean. They're surgical." Eli stayed silent. The wind tugged gently at his sleeves. Annie turned, her expression somewhere between disbelief and admiration. "That last shot, it split the bullseye dead center. That's a 1 in a million kind of placement." Eli shrugged, half embarrassed. "Lucky streak." "No," she said firmly. "Don't do that. Don't shrug this away." She picked up a small measuring tool from her clipboard pouch and checked the spacing. Her eyes widened. "Do you know what you just did?" Eli shook his head. "You didn't just match the fair's record. You shattered the standing range record. By 2 millimeters. This hasn't been done in over 20 years. He blinked. "Seriously?" Annie nodded. "Dead serious. That shot, it's not just rare. It's almost unheard of." For a long moment they both stood still, the weight of the moment thick between them. Then Annie stepped closer, her voice softer. You have no idea how much this means, do you? Eli raised an eyebrow. I've worked here 7 years, she continued. I've seen cocky guys, trained shooters, former Marines, but no one's come out here and done that. Not under pressure, not under judgment, and certainly not after being laughed at by half the town. Eli looked down. I didn't come out to make noise. I know, she said, but sometimes the quietest shot makes the loudest echo. He chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. I want to offer you something, she added. Eli looked up. I'm not just the manager here. I also run the youth outreach program for at-risk teens. We teach them patience, discipline, how to breathe through chaos. We need someone with your skill set and, frankly, your heart. He hesitated. It's just Saturdays, paid, flexible, and it could really use someone the kids can look up to. Eli didn't answer right away, but the silence wasn't resistance, it was consideration. The kind that settled into his bones and made something quiet bloom inside. I'll think about it, he said, echoing the words from last week. But this time, his tone was different. This time, it sounded like yes. That evening, Eli and Sophie ate dinner on the porch, the same way they always did. But something in the air had shifted. She leaned against him, poking at the peas on her plate. Did you shoot today? She asked. I did. And? He looked at her and smiled. Let's just say I hit the mark. She grinned. I knew it. And in that moment, Eli understood. She'd never needed him to be perfect. She only needed him to show up and keep aiming. The next few days drifted by in quiet rhythm. Morning repairs, Sophie's school drop-offs, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and long evenings on the porch where fireflies blinked like soft-spoken promises. But something had changed. Eli couldn't name it at first. It wasn't just the echo of that perfect shot or the sudden attention from a town that had long ignored him. It wasn't even the quiet buzz in Sophie's voice when she told her classmates, "My dad broke the record." It was something else. It was the way his own hands felt steadier, the way he stood a little taller in the grocery store line, the way he met his own gaze in the mirror and didn't immediately look away. He was still a man patched together with grief and obligation, but now there was structure beneath the scars, a spine forming again. Still, when Annie called 3 days later and asked if he could meet her at the range, Eli hesitated. Not because he didn't want to, but because he did. Too much, maybe. The late afternoon light was soft and gold, slanting through the pine trees behind the range. Annie was already there, kneeling near the supply shed, reorganizing cardboard boxes filled with safety gear and ear protection. She looked up and smiled as he approached, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. You came. Eli shoved his hands into the pockets of his jacket. You asked. That I did, she said, standing. Come on, let's walk. He followed her across the gravel lot, past the silent targets and empty benches. The place felt different without the festival crowd. Quieter, more like a sanctuary than a spectacle. Annie stopped at a shaded picnic table near the tree line where 2 styrofoam cups sat waiting. Coffee, she offered, sliding one toward him. It's from Joe's. Not great, but it'll do. Eli sat slowly, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. Thanks. Annie took a sip from hers, then leaned forward slightly. I didn't bring you here to talk about shooting. Eli raised an eyebrow. No? No, she said. I brought you here because I see something in you, and I think it's time you saw it too. He didn't answer. Not yet. He waited. Annie continued, her voice steady. I wasn't exaggerating last weekend. The way you handled yourself, on the range, under pressure, after the things that were said, it spoke volumes. You didn't just shoot well, Eli. You led by example. That matters. He shifted in his seat, unsure how to respond. I run a youth program here, she went on. You know that. But what you may not know is, these kids, most of them don't have anyone steady in their lives. Some come from foster care. Some have fathers who left. Others, well, they've seen more than they should. Eli nodded slowly. I've seen that too. I know you have, she said softly. That's why I think you'd be perfect. He looked at her then, really looked. Annie wasn't just trying to be nice. There was no pity in her eyes, just clarity, purpose. You want me to teach them? He asked. I want you to show them what it looks like to be calm under fire, she said. to stand tall without shouting, to aim true even when no one thinks you can. Eli let out a slow breath. I don't know if I'm the example you're looking for. Why? She challenged, not unkindly. Because you've struggled? Because you've fallen and gotten back up? Because you're a single dad working twice as hard for half the thanks? He met her gaze. She didn't flinch. Eli, she said gently, these kids don't need perfect. They need real. And you're one of the realest people I've met in this town. Silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, just full of things unspoken. Finally, he asked, what would it look like? 2 Saturdays a month, she said. You'd work with a small group, mostly boys, a few girls. Some of them already know how to handle a rifle. Others are just here to feel safe. You'd teach safety, focus, control, and you'd get paid, of course. It's not much, but it's honest. Eli stared at the table, tracing the rim of his cup with one finger. I'd need to bring Sophie, he said. Annie smiled. We'd love to have her. There's a quiet corner in the lodge where she can do homework, or she can help. Kids listen to other kids more than they do to us sometimes. He nodded slowly. I'd have to ease into it. That's the only way worth doing anything. Eli exhaled. The breeze stirred the pine needles behind them, carrying the faint scent of resin and old wood. You know, he said quietly, I didn't think I'd find anything like this again. A place where I mattered, where what I used to be could become something good again. Annie's voice was gentle. You never stopped being good, Eli. You just forgot how to believe it. He looked up, eyes stinging more than he wanted to admit. All right, he said. Annie blinked. All right, I'll do it, he confirmed. I don't know if I'm what they need, but I'll show up, and I'll try. A slow smile spread across her face, genuine and steady. That's more than enough, she said. Later that night, Eli sat on the porch while Sophie finished her bath. The sun had dipped below the trees, and the cicadas were beginning their nightly song. He sipped the rest of the coffee from earlier, now cold but oddly comforting. A reminder of something offered and something accepted. He heard footsteps behind him, small and quick. Daddy? Yeah, Bug? She climbed onto his lap in her pajamas, tucking her legs under her. Did Miss Annie call you? She did. You gonna work with her now? I think so, he said. Just a little at first. Sophie smiled sleepily. She likes you, Eli chuckled. You think? She said you're steady, Sophie murmured, already drifting. That means you don't tip over. He kissed the top of her damp head. Let's hope she's right. And as the stars blinked into view one by one, Eli felt it again. That subtle shift inside him. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady, like something beginning to heal. The air on Saturday morning held the faint bite of fall, crisp enough to turn breath into mist and awaken senses dulled by routine. Eli stood outside the range office. Sophie's small hand curled inside his, her pink backpack slung over one shoulder, and a wide grin stretching across her face. You nervous? She asked, looking up at him with eyes so clear it made the question sound like kindness instead of teasing. Not really, he said, lying like all fathers do when they want to sound brave. She tilted her head. You're doing that thing with your jaw. What thing? That grinding thing. You do it when you're pretending not to be scared. Eli exhaled a quiet laugh. You've been spying on me, huh? Sophie nodded solemnly, then gave his arm a light squeeze. You'll be great, Daddy. You always are. It never ceased to humble him, how freely she believed. He squeezed back. Okay, Bug. Let's go see what Miss Annie has for us. Annie met them inside the small log cabin-style office that doubled as both front desk and instructor lounge. She wore a dark flannel shirt rolled to the elbows and jeans with scuffed boots, her hair pulled into a low ponytail. Practical, confident, real. Morning, Morgan Duo, she said with a smile that landed squarely between friendly and warm. Sophie beamed and waved. Hi, Miss Annie. Annie crouched slightly to meet Sophie's eye level. You ready to be my assistant today? Sophie nodded enthusiastically. I brought colored pencils. Perfect. The lodge has a big corner window, sunlight all day long. Great for art. She stood and turned to Eli. And you, ready for the wolves? He raised an eyebrow. You mean teenagers? Worse, she grinned. Teenagers with something to prove. Eli followed her through the back door into the open range area, where 5 kids, 3 boys, 2 girls, were already lined up, each wearing hearing protection and safety goggles. Their postures varied. One slouched in classic teenage apathy, another stood rigid with anxiety. One girl kept glancing at her phone until Annie gently took it and dropped it into a plastic bin, labeled distractions. Eli scanned their faces. Every one of them reminded him of someone from his past. Raw-boned kids from hard homes, trying to act older than their years. Annie gestured to him. "All right, folks, this is Mr. Morgan. He'll be working with us. Marine vet, record holder at this range, and someone you'll listen to unless you want to do push-ups until your arms fall off." A nervous chuckle ran through the group. Eli held up a hand. "Let's skip the push-ups," he said, "but I will ask you for focus. This isn't about showing off. This is about control, respect, precision." The teens watched him, skeptical but attentive. One boy, tall and wiry with a chipped front tooth, raised a hand. "What if we suck?" Eli smiled. "Then you get better." Simple, honest. It seemed to satisfy. The lesson began with stance and breathing. Eli moved slowly, giving each student space but watching everything, the twitch of a shoulder, the grip on the stock, the rise and fall of a chest. He forgot, somewhere in the rhythm of it, to feel nervous. His voice settled. His hands moved instinctively. Every time he corrected posture or adjusted footwork, something inside him smoothed. The boy with the chipped tooth nailed the second target on his third shot. The rigid girl loosened after Eli knelt beside her and quietly said, "No one here is judging you, least of all me." When a younger student flinched at the sound of his own first shot, Eli placed a steadying hand on his shoulder and said, "Loud doesn't mean dangerous. We control the loud. That's the point." By noon, they had gone through half a box of ammunition and 2 thermoses of cocoa. Annie leaned against the bench near the shed, arms crossed, watching him. There was no evaluation in her gaze, just something soft, like someone watching the tide return to a beach long thought abandoned. "You were meant for this," she said when they broke for lunch. Eli shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's just teaching." "No," she replied. "It's rebuilding. For them. And maybe for you too." He didn't answer right away. The truth was too close to the surface, too raw. Later that day, after the students had been picked up one by one, and Sophie had fallen asleep in the corner of the lodge, colored pencils scattered like stars across the rug, Annie joined Eli outside where he was locking up the supply shed. She handed him a paper cup. "End-of-day coffee tradition, weak but warm." He took it. "Thanks." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Annie broke it, softly. "I hope you'll stay on." He looked over at her. "You sure I didn't scare them off?" "They'll be back. They're not used to someone who doesn't shout." "I spent a long time learning how to stop shouting," Eli said almost under his breath. "In war, in grief, in fatherhood. It's not easy to be quiet when the world feels loud." She turned toward him fully, her voice lower. "That's why they need you." He studied her steadiness, her unwavering presence. A hand offered, still open. "I'll stay on," he said finally, "if you'll have me." She smiled, not wide, not theatrical, just deeply, quietly sure. "I already do." That night, as Eli carried Sophie into the house, her arms looped sleepily around his neck, she whispered, "Did the kids like you?" "I think so," he replied. "Did you like them?" "I really did." She snuggled closer. "I hope you go again. You sound happy." Eli paused at the threshold, watching the porch light cast their shadows together against the wall. "I think I will, Bug." And he meant it, because sometimes rebuilding didn't require a blueprint, just a place to begin, and someone who believed the foundation was still worth saving. The Saturday sessions became a rhythm, like the tick of a clock Eli hadn't realized he'd missed. Every other weekend, he loaded Sophie into the truck before sunrise, her hair in a sleepy braid, her feet in boots that still had last month's dried mud in the soles. The first few mornings, she'd ride in silence, cradling a thermos of cocoa and blinking against the foggy windows. But by the 3rd or 4th drive, she was humming along with the radio, asking if Miss Annie would be bringing blueberry muffins again. "She brought them once," Eli said, fighting a smile. "Doesn't mean it's a tradition." It should be, Sophie replied, firm and certain. And somehow it was. The lodge on the range had once been a storage shed, but Annie had transformed it into something warmer. There was a bookshelf in the corner now, filled with second-hand paperbacks, and 2 rows of children's books Sophie had started sorting by color. A beanbag chair had appeared one morning with no explanation. A faded quilt with hand-stitched initials was draped across the back of the couch. The walls held old photographs of the town's early sharpshooters, including a few grainy black and whites of women in long skirts, holding bolt-action rifles with defiant eyes. It felt like a place with memory, and now, new ones being made. One afternoon after the teens had cleared out, Eli found Sophie and Annie seated cross-legged on the lodge floor, a coloring book spread between them. They were debating the proper color for a unicorn's mane. "I still say silver," Annie said, holding up a glitter pen. "Silver is too obvious," Sophie replied without looking up. "Unicorns are mysterious. They should have deep colors, like ocean green or plum." Annie glanced up at Eli and grinned. "I've been outvoted." He leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, his heart catching at the scene. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it felt so effortlessly right. There was no hesitation in Sophie's posture, no guarded space between her and the woman beside her. Just trust, just joy, just new roots quietly taking hold. In the weeks that followed, things unfolded gently. Annie started stopping by the house on weekday evenings, dropping off paperwork or leftover baked goods, too much for one person, though Eli suspected the surplus was less accidental than she let on. Sometimes she stayed for coffee. Sometimes she stayed to help Sophie with a school project or to sit on the porch with Eli and talk about anything but guns and range protocol, books, music, the strange quiet that comes in a town after the fair packs up. Annie wasn't loud or overwhelming. She didn't force herself into the gaps Emma had left behind. She simply showed up again and again until her presence was familiar. "Welcome." One Friday evening, Sophie asked a question that stopped Eli cold. "Do you think Miss Annie would come with us to the Harvest Festival?" He blinked. "You mean, as in, with us?" Sophie tilted her head. "Yeah, like, with us." Eli didn't answer right away. He stirred the spaghetti sauce on the stove while the question settled somewhere in his chest. It wasn't just that Sophie liked Annie. It was how easily she'd folded her into their little world. "I can ask her," he said finally. Sophie nodded, unconcerned. "She'll say yes." That kind of certainty only came from children and people who hadn't been let down yet. He hoped Sophie was right. The next day after the training session, Eli walked Annie out to the truck as she loaded a crate of ammo into the back seat. The light was soft, stretching golden fingers across the trees. "I have a question," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Annie raised an eyebrow. "Should I be nervous?" "That depends." She waited. "Sophie wants to know if you'll come to the Harvest Festival. With us." The words sounded heavier aloud than they had in his head. Not because they were romantic, not yet, but because they meant something. Because they said, "We see you." Annie's face softened. "You sure?" "She's sure," Eli said, "and I trust her instincts." Annie smiled. "Then I'd love to." There was a pause, comfortable, expectant. "I wasn't sure this would happen," Eli admitted, letting anyone in again. "You don't have to be sure," she said. "You just have to be open." He nodded. "I'm not trying to be anything," she added. "Not a replacement. Not a rescue. I know. I just like being here. With you two." Something quiet stirred between them then. Like the slow bloom of a morning glory, soft and steady and real. "Then we're glad you are," he said. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep with her head on his chest during a movie they didn't finish, Eli sat on the porch alone. The stars above Willow Creek blinked like distant lanterns, and the hum of crickets swelled in waves. He sipped coffee and thought about how grief had carved him hollow, but not beyond repair. Thought about how Annie hadn't come in like a storm. She'd come in like weather changing over time, subtle, warming. And for the first time in years, Eli didn't feel like he was surviving the days. He felt like he was living them. One sunrise, one small step, one shared smile at a time. The sky was ink black above Willow Creek, scattered with stars so bright and close it felt like you could reach out and touch one. The air was cool but not biting, the kind of evening that invited long walks and longer silences. Eli had offered to help Annie take down decorations after the town's harvest festival. She'd hesitated at first, but when he showed up with Sophie asleep in the truck and a gentle look in his eyes, she simply handed him a spool of twinkle lights and said, "You get the high ones." Now the booths were folded up, the hay bales stacked into neat rows behind the town barn, and the last string of lights had been coiled into a tub. The two of them stood at the edge of the field, where the tall grass met the gravel of the back road, neither in a hurry to say goodbye. Annie folded her arms over her chest, eyes lifted toward the constellations. "Did you ever think," she asked, "that stars look sad?" Eli turned toward her. "Sad?" She nodded. "Like they're always watching people get close and drift apart. They see everything, but they can't change anything." He considered that. "I think they're just patient." "Patient?" "Yeah, like they're waiting for us to stop being scared, to say what we mean." She glanced at him, lips tugging into a faint smile. "Is that what you're doing now? Saying what you mean?" Eli exhaled slowly, eyes on the horizon. "I think I've spent most of my life surviving," he said, "wearing pain like armor, being what someone else needed, a soldier, a father, a mechanic, a ghost." Annie didn't interrupt. She just listened. "But lately," he went on, voice low, "I've started wanting more than that. Not in some big dramatic way. Just a morning where I don't wake up feeling like I owe the world an apology. A night where I can sit with someone and not be afraid of what she'll see if I let my guard down." Annie's voice was gentle. "What do you think she'd see?" He turned to her now, really facing her. The soft light from the last lamppost caught the edges of her face, the curve of her jaw, the quiet steadiness in her eyes. "I think she'd see a man who still doesn't have all the pieces together," he said, "but who's finally trying, who wants to be better, not just for his daughter, but for himself." She stepped closer. "And what if she doesn't need you to have it all together?" He smiled, a little sad. "That's the part that scares me most." They stood there for a while, the night humming around them, crickets, wind in the grass, the faint rustle of trees. Then Annie spoke, barely above a whisper. "You know what I see, Eli?" He looked at her. "I see a man who shows up, who teaches kids how to breathe through fear, who makes his daughter laugh and remembers how she likes her toast. I see someone who listens when most people are too busy talking." Eli blinked, throat tightening. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she said. "You never did." The wind carried her words into the space between them, and Eli felt it. A wall, long built and reinforced over years of grief and guilt. Finally shifting, cracking. He took a step forward. Not much, just enough to let the air change. "I'm still figuring things out," he said quietly. "Still caring more than I should." Annie reached for his hand. Not urgently, not dramatically, just steady and sure. "We all are," she said, "but sometimes carrying it together makes it feel lighter." Her fingers curled around his. They stood like that under the stars. No promises, no declarations, just presence, just truth. Eventually, Eli spoke again. "Emma used to love this time of year," he said. "The smell of apples, the sound of dry leaves. For a long time, I thought enjoying it without her meant forgetting her." Annie nodded. "I get that. But being here with you," he said, squeezing her hand gently, "I don't feel like I'm forgetting anymore. I feel like I'm remembering in a new way, one that doesn't hurt." She leaned her head lightly on his shoulder. "That's not forgetting. That's healing." They stayed there a while longer, letting the silence say what words couldn't. There would be more conversations to come, hard ones, joyful ones, uncertain ones. But for now, this was enough. A moment beneath the stars, a man letting go of guilt, a woman offering grace, a beginning. When Eli returned to the truck, Sophie stirred in the back seat. "You were gone a long time," she mumbled. He smiled, reaching back to adjust the blanket around her. "Sorry, Bug." "You okay?" she asked, voice still thick with sleep. He looked at her, her small face barely lit by the dash lights, and nodded. "I think I'm better than okay." She blinked up at him. "Did Miss Annie say yes?" He chuckled. To what? I don't know, she said, snuggling back into the pillow. Whatever you were hoping she'd say. Eli's smile lingered long after her breathing deepened. Because in a way, yes. Yes, she did. The first frost came overnight, painting the edges of Willow Creek in delicate silver. Grass stiffened. The morning smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon. It was the kind of weather that made people instinctively draw closer, share thermoses, touch hands more often, lean in during conversation. But not that morning. That morning, Eli stood alone in the range's storage shed, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the two men arguing near the gate. One of them was Wade Carlson. The other was a young man with a notepad and a press badge. Annie stood between them, her face unreadable. From where Eli stood, he couldn't hear what was being said, only the tone, sharp, defensive, agitated. Wade gestured toward the range. The reporter scribbled furiously. Annie raised her voice, trying to calm things down, but the moment already felt poison. Eli stepped out into the cold, slow and steady. As he approached, Wade spotted him and grinned, a mean, triumphant curl of the lips. "Speak of the devil," he called out, "the Marine himself." The reporter turned, eyes bright with curiosity. "Mr. Morgan? Eli Morgan?" Annie looked up, startled. "Eli, I didn't ask him to." "What's going on?" Eli asked flatly. Wade clapped the reporter on the back. "Just helping this fella get the facts. Small-town hero, war-torn past, dead kid in Kandahar. Makes for one hell of a headline, don't you think?" Eli's blood ran cold. The reporter cleared his throat. "I'm with the Tribune. We're doing a feature on post-combat veterans reintegrating into civilian life. Your record at the festival drew attention. Then your name came up in connection with a classified report from—" "It's not classified," Eli said sharply. Annie stepped forward. "This is not the time or place." "I didn't authorize anything," Eli said, eyes on her now. "I didn't either," she replied, firm but quiet. "Wade told him where to find you. I only found out 10 minutes ago." But something in Eli shifted, because Annie didn't look surprised. She looked tired, frustrated, maybe even guilty. "You knew he was coming," Eli said, his voice low. "I didn't know when," she said. "But yes, he left a message last week. I didn't want to worry you." "You didn't tell me?" "I wanted to talk to you first. I didn't think it would escalate." Wade stepped back, hands up in mock surrender. "Just trying to bring a little truth to the hero narrative, that's all." Eli ignored him. His eyes were locked on Annie now, his voice barely audible. "You said I didn't have to prove anything to you." "You don't," she said. "But this isn't about us. It's about the program, the kids. If this story breaks without context—" "I am the context," Eli said. "And I trusted you." Annie's face went pale. The reporter, sensing the tension, quietly slipped away toward the parking lot, notebook tucked into his jacket. Wade lingered a moment longer, savoring the chaos before finally walking off. Eli turned away. "Eli, please," Annie called after him. "Let me explain." But he was already halfway to his truck. He didn't answer her calls that day, or the next. He went through the motions, packed Sophie's lunch, fixed the water heater for Mrs. Devlin, showed up to the range for youth class but kept it strictly technical. No eye contact, no extra words, just business. Sophie noticed first. On Tuesday night, as they folded laundry, she asked, "Did something happen with Miss Annie?" Eli paused mid-fold. "Why do you ask? You're quiet, quieter than usual, and you didn't smile when she dropped off the muffins." He exhaled. "Sometimes grown-ups disagree." Sophie studied him. "Are you going to fix it?" Eli looked down at the small sweater in his hands, the one Annie had complimented just last week. "I don't know." On Thursday afternoon, Annie came to the house. Eli almost didn't answer the door, but Sophie, standing behind him, whispered, "Please." So he opened it. Annie stood there holding a manila folder. She looked tired, but not defeated. "I called the reporter," she said. "Told him the story's off. No quotes, no range mention, no names." Eli leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Damage done." "Maybe," she said. "But I didn't betray you. I made a mistake. A big one, but not a betrayal." He didn't speak. Annie stepped closer. You want to know the worst part? I kept the reporter's message because I thought it might help. I thought if people knew what you'd overcome, they'd admire you more. They'd see the courage I see. Eli's jaw clenched. I didn't ask for admiration. I just wanted peace. I know, she said, and I took that from you. I'm sorry. He studied her face, the way it carried honesty like a burden. Not performative, not desperate, just real. Finally, he said, I'm not angry you made a mistake. I'm angry you didn't trust me enough to make it with me. Annie nodded, eyes shining. I should have. I will if you let me try again. Silence. Then Sophie appeared beside him, eyes wide and hopeful. Eli glanced down at her, then back at Annie. I need time, he said. Take it, she replied. I'll be here. And she walked away without another word. No dramatics, no pressure. Just space. That night, Eli stood on the porch long after Sophie had gone to bed, staring at the empty stars. It hurt, trusting someone. But maybe the real test wasn't avoiding pain. Maybe it was learning how to come back after it. Winter came softly that year. It didn't arrive with blizzards or ice storms, but with the quiet hush of frost on window panes and the slow creak of old wood under wool socks. The kind of winter that invited stillness. Reflection. Eli sat on the porch with a mug of coffee cradled in his hands, steam curling upward, catching the first light of morning. Inside, Sophie's laughter filtered through the door as she wrapped string lights around the banister, her annual December tradition. He hadn't spoken to Annie in nearly 3 weeks, not since she'd left the manila folder on his porch, not since he told her he needed time. But the space had done something. It hadn't pushed her away. It had revealed something quieter, deeper, that her presence in his life had never been about spectacle. It had always been about consistency, and that consistency was missed. More than missed, it was needed. Later that morning, a knock sounded at the door. Eli opened it to find a small box sitting on the step, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. No name, no note, just a return address, Brooks Range Lodge. He brought it inside, set it on the table. Sophie watched curiously. You gonna open it? She asked. He hesitated, then carefully untied the string. Inside was a small ceramic ornament, handmade, uneven, with 3 figures painted in warm, earthy tones. A man, a woman, and a little girl holding both their hands. At the bottom, scrawled in faint gold, not perfect, just ours. Eli's fingers brushed over the paint, and something inside him, something long clenched, finally let go. That evening, he and Sophie drove through Willow Creek's hills, where the snow had just begun to dust the tree branches like powdered sugar. He took the long road on purpose, the one that curved past the old mill and down toward the edge of the pine forest, where the town looked small and golden in the distance. Sophie in the back seat pointed excitedly. Look, lights at the lodge. Eli pulled in slowly, headlights sweeping across familiar gravel. Annie was standing on the porch, bundled in a deep red scarf, arms crossed against the cold. He stepped out of the truck, not rushing, just walking steady, like the ground had learned how to hold him again. She looked up as he approached. You came. I should have come sooner, he said. You came, she repeated. That's enough. He nodded, then reached into his coat pocket and held out the ornament. This did something, she smiled. I hoped it would. There was a pause. Breath misted in the air between them. Eli took another step closer. You were right. About everything. About weight being lighter when it's shared. About needing to stop surviving and start choosing. He looked down, then back up at her. And I choose this, he said softly. Whatever this is. Not because I've healed all the way, but because I want to keep healing. With you. Annie didn't speak. She just stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Not as someone fixing him, but as someone choosing him too. Later that week, they walked through town together for the Christmas tree lighting. Sophie held Annie's hand without hesitation, pointing at decorations and naming every bulb color aloud. At one point, Annie looked over and whispered, She's happy. Eli nodded. She was always the brave one. You both were, she replied. The mayor flicked the switch, and the big tree lit up in a cascade of gold and green. People clapped. A brass band played something a little off-key but full of heart. Snow started to fall, slow and quiet. Annie leaned against Eli's shoulder. "You know," she said, "I read somewhere that snow is just frozen rain that learned how to fall gently." Eli looked at her. "Maybe that's what we're doing too," she smiled. "Learning to fall?" He shook his head. "Learning to land." On Christmas morning, they stood together in the living room, watching Sophie tear through wrapping paper and giggle over a lopsided gingerbread house Annie had helped her build. The tree was crooked. The hot chocolate was slightly burned. And it was perfect. Not because it lacked scars, but because it held them, gently, without shame. Because sometimes the most beautiful stories aren't about avoiding the storm. They're about learning how to dance in the quiet that follows. And finally, Eli understood. He hadn't lost everything. He'd just taken the long way home. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. It's always so heartwarming to see this little storytelling community reach places near and far. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey. We share stories of love, kindness, resilience, and the quiet miracles that can change a life. Thank you for spending your time with us. Until next time, take care and never stop believing in second chances.